Hi, I'm Dr Ursula Hackett, author of Brilliant Essays, your practical guide for university essay writing success. Welcome to my special video series on dissertation writing. This video offers some best practices for evidence gathering. I'll show you how to use the intuitions behind the process tracing technique to assess the strength of your evidence base and test the relationship between the evidence you gather and your specific research question. Process tracing is an analytical technique for drawing inferences from diagnostic pieces of evidence. It's typically used for qualitative research with a temporal component, but I think the intuitions behind process tracing tests are helpful for all sorts of research. There are 4 key tests that you can use to examine the validity of your research hypotheses, as outlined by David Collier. Let's look at how each of these tests could be applied to some actual research questions. Why did Brexit Party voters switch back to the Conservatives? Why did Russia intervene in Syria? Does gender stereotyping explain women's underrepresentation in politics? Is veganism a form of political participation? First, straw in the wind tests. These are the weakest of the 4 tests. They increase the plausibility of a given hypothesis or raise doubts about it, but are not decisive by themselves. When Sherlock Holmes investigated the mystery of a missing racehorse and the murder of the horse's trainer in Arthur Conan Doyle's The Adventure of Silver Blaze, one crucial clue is that the watchdog didn't bark in the night. Holmes deduces that the dog didn't bark because the perpetrator was familiar to the dog, so that's a straw in the wind test incriminating the horse's trainer. Other straw in the wind tests might be the fact that Boris Johnson was well liked by Brexit Party voters in 2019, that vegans care about animal welfare, fewer women than men enter politics and win elections, and that a Russian pipeline is planned to traverse Syria, bringing gas to lucrative European markets. None of these facts are sufficient on their own to rule anything out or in definitively, but they're all suggestive. The combination of many separate straw in the wind tests might start to persuade you that one answer or another is the right one. A more demanding standard is the hoop test. The hypothesis must jump through the hoop to remain under consideration, but passing the test does not by itself affirm the hypothesis. If we were investigating a murder, then a classic hoop test would be: who was in the house when the murder took place? Just because Jane was in the house at the time doesn't make her a murderer, but if she had an alibi and could be definitively placed away from the house at that time, then we could certainly rule her out of consideration. A weaker hoop test might be: who was in the town when the murder took place? Again, if Jane wasn't there, then she definitely didn't do it, but we can't infer much from the fact that she was in the town at the time. For our research questions, hoop tests might be that voters hold gender stereotypes and connect them to candidates. If they don't, then we can certainly rule out gender stereotyping as an explanation for women's underrepresentation in politics. The timing of voters' defections from the Brexit Party matches the accession of Boris Johnson to the leadership of the Conservatives. If the timing doesn't match, then Boris Johnson's leadership can't be the reason Brexit Party voters switched back to the Tories in 2019. And it's feasible for natural resource extraction to take place in conflict zones like Syria. If it isn't feasible, then resource extraction can't be the reason for intervention in Syria. The conditions laid out in the hoop test are necessary for affirming a hypothesis. If they're not present, then we can rule that hypothesis out of consideration. A third type of test is the smoking gun, which is kind of like the opposite of a hoop test. Passing the test can strongly support a given hypothesis, but failure to pass does not reject it. To come back to our detective example, a suspect caught holding a smoking gun is presumed guilty. However, those with no smoking gun may not be innocent. Maybe they committed the murder some other way and have managed to stash the gun. In the context of our research questions, smoking gun tests might involve successful and unsuccessful female candidates explaining how gender stereotypes have impeded their political progress. That would be sufficient to affirm the idea that gender stereotypes impede women's political progress. But just because interviewees don't mention gender stereotypes doesn't mean that those stereotypes aren't working in subtler ways. Or regarding our veganism research question, if many vegans say that they adopt veganism for political reasons, then we have a smoking gun that affirms the hypothesis that veganism is indeed a form of political participation. Again, if vegans don't say they're adopting the lifestyle for political reasons, that doesn't mean that it isn't political in some subtler way. Passing a smoking gun test is sufficient to affirm a hypothesis, but failing it doesn't make much difference either way. Finally, doubly decisive tests are the most powerful. These tests provide strong inferential leverage that confirms one hypothesis and eliminates all others. You might achieve this by combining multiple tests, which together support one explanation and eliminate all others. If we're detectives, then a doubly decisive test might be CCTV that captures both the burglar's face and the act of stealing. For our research questions, doubly decisive tests might involve multivariate statistical analysis of various different possibilities and the finding that, controlling for rival explanations, the strongest predictor of vote switching was voters' evaluations of Boris Johnson. That would clearly put Johnson's leadership in the frame as the key explanatory factor and rule out alternatives. Or if the timing and patterns of Russian airstrikes show that the regime targeted areas where the Syrian government faced the greatest threat from armed actors, not threats to the gas pipeline, and regime insiders confirm that regime consolidation was the rationale for intervention, then we have evidence that is both necessary and sufficient to affirm the proposition that regime consolidation motivated the intervention, and to rule out the resource extraction story as well. Don't get hung up about what the tests are called or precisely where each piece of evidence fits, because these aren't supposed to be rigid categories, but they can be very useful in terms of thinking about your evidence base and its relationship with your research hypotheses. Why? Because it forces you to specify your hypotheses precisely. What exactly are your expectations? And identify the conditions under which you'd reject or affirm those hypotheses. The main thing is to consider what the world would look like if you were right, and what it would look like if you were wrong, and match up your quality of your evidence with the strength of your conclusions.